In the previous movie, we laid out grids in very general locations on screen. But naturally, these positions are not very precise with respect to the overall building geometry. So a really important consideration when you're working in a project is getting things placed very precisely. And there's a variety of ways you can do that in a Revit project. But one of the most common ways to do that is what I call sketch, then modify. In other words, we do what we did in the previous movie where we lay things out in a very general position first, just to kind of get something on screen. And then we come back and using a variety of tools that are available to us, we can modify those positions to something very precise. So I'm going to demonstrate that here with the grids on screen and move those grids relative to the existing wall geometry. So let's start with grid line A. I'm going to select it here on screen. And we've already talked about a number of the grips and control handles that appear, such as the open circles and the locks and so forth. But notice that in addition to that, down toward the bottom of the screen, we see a couple dimensions that appear. Now I'm going to come over here to the view control bar. I'm going to click zoom in region, and I'm going to zoom in on this bottom portion of the plan. Now notice that the two dimensions that appear are measured from the inside faces of the walls to the grid line. So if we knew this distance here, we could modify this one. And if we knew this distance here, we could modify that one. Now I want this grid to appear at 50 millimeters off the inside face of the wall. In order to do that, you just simply click right on that dimension value. This is called a temporary dimension, and type in the value you want. So I'll type 50 for 50, press enter, and notice that that will move the grid line closer to the wall, and it's now at exactly 50 millimeters away from that inside face. Now, if I select grid 2, it will display its own temporary dimensions, and I could repeat that step by putting in 50 over here as well. So where I previously had two grids that were placed in a very random location, now they're very precise with respect to the overall building geometry. I probably want grid line 1 to also be 50 millimeters off the inside face. Now before I do that, I'm going to go ahead and click it, but before I edit that dimension value, let me point out one other thing about these temporary dimensions. Notice that there's these two tiny little dots appearing on either side of the dimension. Those are the witness line grip controls. Now, the witness line can actually be located in a variety of locations. Now, when we're talking about a wall, that could be either of the faces of the wall or in the center. Now, to change the location of that witness line, you can either simply click the witness line grip. And notice that it will jump to one of those other faces. If I click it again, it will now jump to the center. Click it one more time, it would jump back to the inside face. The other method is to grab it and drag it to the point that you want. So either one would work just fine. Now, of course, if I really was measuring it to this outside face, I'd now have to do the math here to determine exactly how far that distance ought to be. Now, if I hover over this wall, I see that it's a 300 millimeter wall. So if I wanted that 50 millimeters from the inside face, that means that this distance would have to be 350 millimeters. Now, it's probably easier to measure it from the inside face, so moving the witness lines was probably not the best way to do it in that case, but it's important to show you that technique because in some cases you may need to do that. For example, if I zoom back out here, let's say that I wanted to measure grid line C off of grid line B. Well, to do that, if I select, notice that it's not actually displaying those witness line locations measured from B, it's actually measuring them relative to the nearby wall. Well, that means that I would have to grab this grip like I just showed you and drag it, and when it snaps to grid line B, I can let go, and then I would be able to input a value right here. Now, I actually am rethinking that, and I'd rather go 50 millimeters off of this wall right there, but maybe I want to use that technique to move grid line D. And so you can use the same techniques in different cases, regardless of which one you're manipulating. In this case, I'll go with 9500. And you can see now that I've moved grid line D relative to grid line C instead of having to do the math relative to the wall. So you can use whichever technique gets you in the position that you need it to be. Let's just go ahead and finish up a couple of these. And this final one, I'll measure off of grid line 2, like so. Now keep in mind that you've got two dimensions on either side. So sometimes folks make this error. If I now wanted to change the distance between grid line 3 and 4, and I do something like this, and I change this, notice what's going to happen. It wasn't grid line 4 that moved, it was grid line 3 again. So I'm going to do Control Z to undo that. Always keep in mind that when you're manipulating temporary dimensions, whatever you have selected is the item that's going to move. So in this case, because grid line 3 is selected, if I edit either of these dimensions, it will move either up or down depending on what number I put in. If it's grid line 4 that I want to move relative to 3, then I need to select 4 first, adjust the position of the dimension, and then input my value. Now in this case, I don't actually want to move it, but it's important to keep that in mind. So temporary dimensions are a very powerful way for you to take what's a very rough layout, almost like a virtual napkin sketch in your Revit model, and fine-tune the positions and make them very, very precise. The basic process is you sketch out a layout, and then you come back and use the temporary dimensions and make it very precise.